In 1993, a young actor was shot dead on a film set by a gun that was supposed to be empty. The movie got finished anyway. It became a cult classic. And 30 years later, half the cast still won't talk about what happened. Here's the real story behind The Crow, the accident, the so-called curse, and where the surviving cast actually ended up. The origin, a comic built out of grief. Before this gets into the cast, it helps to understand where The Crow actually came from, because it didn't start as a pitch. It didn't start in a Hollywood office. It started as one man trying to survive something unbearable, and finding no way through it except to draw. In 1978, James O'Barr's 18-year-old fiancée Beverly was killed by a drunk driver. He had no framework for that kind of loss. He was a young man with nowhere to put his grief. So in 1981, he started drawing, pulling from his own pain and a news story about a couple murdered in Detroit over a $20 engagement ring. Out of those two things came a black and white graphic novel soaked in Joy Division and Gothic romanticism, in post-punk bitterness and raw, unprocessed loss. He wasn't trying to make a cult classic. He was trying to keep moving. The Crow was published in 1989 and sold 1.5 million copies. It found its audience among people who recognized something of their own grief in its pages, readers who understood what it felt like to lose something that couldn't be replaced, and who responded to a story that didn't try to make that feeling neat or resolved. When O'Barr later learned what had happened to Brandon Lee during the filming of the adaptation, he said the feelings of guilt and responsibility were enormous. A story born from one death had somehow become entangled in another. That weight runs underneath everything that follows. Brandon Lee, a breakthrough cut short. Most people remember him as Eric Draven, the white face paint, the long black coat, the quiet menace of someone who's already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. Fewer people remember how hard he worked to get there, or how much this specific role meant to him personally. He was the son of Bruce Lee, who died when Brandon was just 8 years old. That loss shaped everything that followed. He grew up carrying his father's name, his father's shadow, and the unspoken weight of being the son of someone who had already become a myth before Brandon was old enough to fully understand what that meant. The comparisons were inevitable and constant. Every audition, every interview, every role he landed got measured against a man who had died before he could know him properly. He studied acting at Emerson College and the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute, a deliberate choice to develop his own craft on his own terms, not simply to inherit a legacy. He trained in multiple martial arts disciplines, Jeet Kune Do, Wing Chun, Eskrima, Muay Thai, but he was building something distinctly his, an identity that stood on its own. By the early 1990s, it was working. Rapid Fire in 1992. The parts were getting bigger. The trajectory was building. And then The Crow came along, and everything pointed toward this being the moment. He proposed to his fiancée Eliza Hutton in Venice, Italy, while on a press tour. She was a casting director working in Hollywood, and she was on set with him frequently during the Crow shoot. Their wedding was planned for April 17, 1993, in Ensenada, Mexico at sunset, 1 week after he was scheduled to wrap filming. His friend George Clooney later recalled that Brandon's cousin, Miguel Ferrer, was set to be best man. Clooney and Lee had played basketball together at the Hollywood Yimka 3 times a week. This was his big break, Clooney said afterward. He wasn't wrong. For the role, Lee dropped 20 pounds to achieve the lean, almost skeletal look of a rock musician back from the dead. He developed his own fighting style for the film, not his father's technique, specifically his own, blending aerobics with martial arts in a way that felt distinct and personal. For the resurrection scene, he submerged himself in bags of ice to physically simulate what climbing out of a grave might feel like. Not because the camera would show it, because he wanted to feel something real before the take. He was also pushing the production to stay faithful to O'Barr's original comic, reportedly quoting lines from the source material during filming, insisting that the film carry the emotional weight the graphic novel had always held. On set, he told people that his next and most important role was going to be being a husband to Eliza and a father to their future children. He was 17 days from wrapping, 18 days from his wedding. The set that kept going wrong filming began in February 1993, at Carolco Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina. The production was nearly finished by late March, and from the very beginning, almost nothing had gone smoothly. A localized hurricane tore through and destroyed major sets. On the very first day of shooting, a carpenter suffered severe burns when his crane struck power lines. 2 electricians were injured in a vehicle collision. A production truck caught fire. A set sculptor had what's been described as a psychological breakdown and drove his car through the studio lot. A construction worker impaled his own hand with a screwdriver. Each incident, taken alone, is a production problem. Taken together, across a single shoot, they accumulate into something that starts to feel different. People on set began using the word cursed. There's also a story, repeated enough times that it's become embedded in the film's mythology, about a cryptic voicemail left for the production team before filming even began, warning of dire consequences if they proceeded. Whether that detail has picked up embellishment over 30 years of retelling is difficult to verify, but it circulates, and it fits the atmosphere of what the production had actually become. None of that would matter much in retrospect if the last accident hadn't been the one it was. The accident, what actually happened. The scene was straightforward. Eric Draven walks through a doorway carrying a bag of groceries. Fun Boy, the gang member played by Michael Massey, fires at him from 15 feet away. A standard dramatic setup, the kind of thing filmed on sets every day without incident. 2 weeks before this scene, the production had built makeshift dummy rounds for a close-up scene that required the camera to see real-looking ammunition inside the gun. Live cartridges had their gunpowder removed, but critically, their primers were left intact. During that earlier shoot, one of those primers discharged. It lodged a real lead bullet tip deep inside the gun barrel. A squib load, the technical term for exactly this kind of malfunction. Nobody caught it. Nobody inspected the barrel afterward. The gun was returned to the prop room. 2 weeks later, that same gun was loaded with blank rounds for the scene with Massey. Blanks contain gunpowder but no projectile. Standard in film production. Safe when the gun barrel is clear. When Massey pulled the trigger, the force of the blank propelled that still lodged bullet fragment out of the barrel with nearly the velocity of a live round. It struck Brandon Lee in the abdomen, lodged in his spine. He died 6 hours later, after emergency surgery, at 1:03 p.m. on March 31, 1993. He was 28 years old. Eliza Hutton was in California, preparing for their wedding, when she received the call. She flew immediately to North Carolina. She was by his side when he was pronounced dead. She was the one who then had to break the news to his mother and sister when they arrived at the hospital. It was a chain of small failures. A missed inspection, an unchecked barrel, a prop department shortcut taken 2 weeks earlier that nobody ever followed up on, that converged into something nobody can undo. No criminal charges were ever filed. The death was ruled an accident. The set was shut down immediately. Filming was suspended for several days. James O'Barr, who had created The Crow out of his own grief for a dead fiancé, later said that when Brandon died, he had a very, very hard time. That the feelings of guilt and responsibility were enormous. A story born from one man's lost love had now taken someone else's. Finishing the film he started, Paramount Pictures, the original distributor, walked away from the project entirely after Lee's death. Miramax acquired the rights and injected $8 million to complete what was now an almost finished film, built around an actor who was gone. 8 days of Lee's scenes remained unshot. The production used 2 stunt doubles, Chad Stahelski and Jeff Cadiente, combined with early CGI face replacement technology that was genuinely ahead of its time for 1993. Stahelski wasn't just any double. He had trained alongside Lee at the Inosanto Martial Arts Academy. He knew Lee's movement, his physical rhythm, the specific way he occupied a frame. He understood what the performance needed to look like from the inside, not just technically. Decades later, Stahelski would go on to direct the John Wick franchise, arguably the most influential action film series of the 2010s. His entire career in action filmmaking began in the shadow of his friend's death. The character of the Skull Cowboy was cut from the script entirely, and voiceover narration by Sarah, played by a young Rochelle Davis, was added to reframe the film's tone, shifting it toward a retrospective love story told from the outside, looking back. after everything has already happened. A story about resurrection and grief, narrated after the fact, finished by people trying to honor someone they'd already lost. In retrospect, that structure feels almost inevitable. The film was dedicated to Brandon Lee and Eliza Hutton. It released in 1994, opened at #1 in the United States, and made $50.7 million on a $23 million budget. It became a cult classic, not despite the tragedy, but permanently shaped by it. Every viewing carries the weight of knowing what it cost to make. The cast, where they actually ended up. So that's the story behind the film. But there was a full cast around Brandon Lee, and 30 years later, their paths went in some genuinely unexpected directions. Michael Massey's start here, because his story sits differently from all the others. He played Funboy, the gang member who fires the gun in the scene that killed Brandon Lee. And for the rest of his life, that single moment defined how people thought about him. Even though no court, no investigation, and no person who actually understood what happened ever placed blame on him personally. He wasn't even supposed to be holding the gun that day. The director made a last-minute change to the scene just before cameras rolled. Massey hadn't been briefed to handle the weapon until that moment. He pulled the trigger on a gun that the prop department had prepared, that the safety team had cleared, that everyone in the chain of responsibility had signed off on. And it killed someone. In the aftermath, he withdrew from the acting world entirely. He suffered nightmares. He moved back to New York and took a long sabbatical, just to be able to function again. He didn't return to film work for about a year. When he did come back, he built a genuine career as a character actor. CC7N in 1995, recurring work on 24 and Rizzoli and Isles, appearances in The X-Files, Alias, Supernatural, Criminal Minds, and later, The Amazing Spider-Man in 2012. He kept working. He kept showing up. He never let what happened define what he was willing to try. But he never watched The Crow, not once. Not in the year it came out, not in the decade after, not ever. In 2005, 12 years after the accident, he gave his first on-camera interview about what had happened. What happened to Brandon was a tragic accident, he said. It's something that I'm going to live with. I don't think you ever get over something like that. He described being plagued by nightmares. He said he had leaned on close friends and family just to get through it. In another interview, he added, "It absolutely wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't even supposed to be handling the gun in the scene until the director changed it at the last minute. No criminal charges were ever brought. The death was ruled an accident. But none of that legal clarity changes what it meant to be the person holding the weapon when it happened. That is a weight that doesn't dissolve with a verdict. It just becomes something you carry." Michael Massey died of stomach cancer on October 20th, 2016, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 64. He never watched the film. He carried what happened for 23 years. He deserves to be remembered as something more than a footnote attached to someone else's tragedy. Rochelle Davis. She played Sarah, the young girl at the center of the story, the narrator whose voiceover holds the finished film together. Her voice is literally the thread that completes it. She was a child when this happened. A child on a film set where the lead actor died. She wasn't a background player. She was present throughout the production, close with the cast and crew, part of a set that experienced one of the most devastating accidents in Hollywood history, while she was still young enough that the full weight of it took years to settle in. That kind of experience doesn't leave you the way a normal production does. She stepped away from acting for decades afterward. Given everything she'd witnessed at that age, it's genuinely hard to call that surprising. Eventually, she found her way back into the conversation around the film, not through a comeback role or a nostalgia appearance, but through The Crow's Nest, a podcast she hosts where she talks openly about the production, the accident, and what the film has meant to the people who were part of it. It's a different kind of engagement with her own history. More honest, more on her own terms. When the 2024 reboot arrived, she publicly boycotted it and made her position known without ambiguity. Of everyone connected to this film, she has the most layered and complicated relationship with it, because she was the youngest person in the room when everything happened, and she has been living with it the longest. Ernie Hudson. He played Sergeant Albrecht, the only genuinely decent figure in the film, the cop who actually tries to help Eric Draven, rather than obstruct him. a grounding presence in a movie that could have lost itself entirely in its own gothic atmosphere. Hudson never slowed down. 30 years of steady, consistent work across film and television, never locked into one lane, never coasting on a single famous credit. Most people still know him primarily as Winston Zeddemore from Ghostbusters, a role he's returned to across multiple franchise revivals and iterations. In 2025, he was starring in Boston Blue, still actively working, still showing up. No comeback story needed here, because he never disappeared. That's its own kind of achievement. 3 decades of consistent presence without needing a dramatic reinvention to stay relevant. Michael Wincott. He played Top Dollar, the film's central villain. All gravel-voiced menace and theatrical cruelty, the kind of performance that lingers well past the credits. Wincott built a career out of exactly that quality. Decades of memorable, often genuinely unsettling characters across film and television, including a role in Jordan Peele's Nope in 2022 and appearances in Westworld. Not a household name exactly, but the kind of actor directors specifically call when they need someone who can project real menace without tipping into parody. His phone has kept ringing for 30 years because of what he brings to a scene. That's a solid legacy for a villain role from 1994. David Patrick Kelly. He played T-Bird, the gang's de facto leader, the most immediately threatening presence in the film's opening act. Kelly went on to have one of the steadiest, most varied careers in this entire cast. Consistently active on Broadway, regularly working in television across multiple decades. In 2025, he appeared in Only Murders in the Building, a prestige production that attracts serious talent, still getting cast in worthwhile projects more than 30 years after The Crow. Quiet, consistent, respected, no dramatic reinvention arc. Just an actor who kept choosing interesting work and kept building something durable because of it. Tony Todd. He played Grange. And for horror fans, Tony Todd needs almost no introduction beyond his name. He became one of the most recognizable voices and faces in the genre. Not just through Candyman, which made him iconic, but through decades of work that consistently elevated every project he was part of. He was the kind of performer who brought genuine gravity to roles that other actors might have treated as simple paycheck work. Audiences trusted him in a scene. That's rarer than it sounds. He passed away on November 6, 2024, at age 69. Stomach cancer. He died at 69. The horror community felt that loss immediately and publicly. Tributes came in within hours, from directors, fellow actors, and fans who had grown up on his work. That kind of outpouring isn't something you manufacture. It reflects what someone actually meant to the people who watched them work across 30 years. Bai Ling She played Micah, Top Dollar's half-sister, a strung-out gothic poet figure whose brief presence in the film carries a strange dark romanticism that sticks with people long after the credits roll. A small role, but one that landed. This was her first major American film role. She had moved from China to New York in 1991, unable to speak English, and studied at the Lee Strasberg Institute and took film classes at NYU. The Crow was the beginning, and she used that beginning well. What followed was a genuinely wide-ranging career. She starred opposite Richard Gere in Red Corner in 1997, earning the National Board of Review's Breakthrough Female Performance Award and strong critical attention. The film's criticism of human rights abuses in China resulted in her Chinese citizenship being revoked. She became a U.S. citizen. In 1998, People magazine named her one of the 50 most beautiful people in the world. She won Best Supporting Actress at both the Hong Kong Film Awards and the Golden Horse Awards in Taiwan for her work in Dumplings in 2004. As of late 2025, she remains active in independent film and international festival circuits. Of this entire cast, she's one of the very few who built a genuine second act completely separate from The Crow. A career with its own trajectory, its own awards, its own cultural identity. The 2024 reboot, and Why It Failed The Crow franchise, had tried to extend itself multiple times after 1994. 3 sequels, a short-lived television series. None of them came anywhere close to the original. Then, on August 23, 2024, a full reboot arrived. Bill Skarsgård in the lead role, real studio backing, real promotion, real expectations behind it. It bombed, 22% on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics describing a convoluted script and, most damningly, a complete absence of emotional pulse, which, given the subject matter, is a very specific kind of failure. It grossed $24.1 million against a $50 million production budget, a clear commercial loss by any measure. The reason isn't complicated, even if the studio didn't seem to understand it going in. The 1994 film isn't beloved because of its plot mechanics or its production design. It's beloved because of what it costs. Brandon Lee's death didn't separate from the finished film. It became inseparable from it. The tragedy didn't damage the viewing experience. It deepened it. Every frame carries a weight that no reboot can replicate, because that weight is real, and it belongs to a specific person in a specific moment in 1993. You can recast the character. You cannot replicate the loss. Alex Proyas, the original director, condemned the remake publicly. So did Rochelle Davis, the actress who had been a child on the original set and has spent decades carrying what that production actually meant. Both use similar language: cynical, disrespectful, unnecessary. Coming from people who were actually there, that kind of condemnation lands differently than a negative review from a critic who wasn't. The legacy: what changed and what didn't. Brandon Lee's death led to real and lasting change in how film sets manage firearms. Strict barrel inspection protocols became standard industry practice after 1993. Armorers were given clearer authority over prop weapons on set. Chain of custody requirements for firearms became more formalized across productions of all sizes. These were direct, practical responses to what had gone wrong in Wilmington. For almost 3 decades, those changes held. And then, on October 21st, 2021, cinematographer Helena Hutchins was killed on the set of Rust when a firearm held by Alec Baldwin discharged during a rehearsal. Different production, different decade, same fundamental category of failure. A gun that should have been safe wasn't, because the chain of responsibility broke down. Brandon's sister Shannon Lee responded publicly. She noted that the Hollywood community had genuinely come together after Brandon's death, that awareness around firearm safety had increased. And then Rust happened anyway. The same lesson, learned again, at the same cost. The industry response to Rust accelerated a shift that had already been quietly building. By 2026, many productions have moved away from real firearms entirely. Airsoft guns and digital muzzle flash effects replacing live weapons on set. A practical, largely irreversible change that eliminates an entire category of risk at the source. It took 2 deaths, 28 years apart, with essentially identical mechanics, to arrive there. Chad Stahelski, the stunt double who finished Lee's remaining scenes, who trained alongside him, who understood his movement from years of working together, went on to become one of the most respected action directors of his generation. The John Wick franchise redefined what action choreography could look like on screen. His career in action filmmaking began in the shadow of his friend's death, and he has spoken about Lee with consistent respect and genuine affection throughout it. The Crow itself holds an 87% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 75 reviews. The critical consensus reads, "Filled with style and dark, lurid energy, The Crow is an action-packed visual feast that also has a soul," in the performance of the late Brandon Lee. The soul. Not the visual effects, not the production design. The soul. That's the part no reboot could touch. And it's why younger audiences keep finding this film on their own, decades after it was made, because people who love it tell other people about it. That's how things actually last. One film, one accident that should never have happened. A cast that's scattered in every direction afterward. Some thriving, some quietly fading. One who never watched the finished film at all. The original Crow still holds up 30 years later. Not because of the tragedy attached to it, but because that tragedy never overshadowed what the people involved actually built. For a story that started with Obar's own grief in 1981, it's strange how the production ended up echoing the same thing it was trying to.
Oh, Tell.